Oh, little birdie, spring has sprung! Out with the old, in with the new. Like trading in the big store for Dollar General. You'll get the same big store savings without the big store hassle. And with no hike to the store, you're even closer to the name brands you love. Like fresh, Tastic Gain detergent. It's spring in a bottle, people! Stop by Dollar General before Sunday, spend $15 on Gain-scented items, and get 5 off your next trip. Dollar General, it's the fast way to save.
Blog Talk Radio.
Peace and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Civil Alert. This is your host, St. Asha, here with you on this beautiful Thursday night to bring you an episode of Hidden History. Previously, we did a couple of segments with Hidden History, and one that was very well known and talked about was the segment that we did with Amani Bey. I decided that it would be so fitting to bring the series on, and now Hidden History will be featured on the first Thursday and the last Thursday of each month. On Tuesday, Amani Bey came on, and, he had a brief introduction, and you all received a little tidbit of what's to come. And the reason for Hidden History is because, as we know, everything up until this point that has been presented to the people, activity, the social engineering, programming that's going on, is the wool that's been woven as to be a veil over everyone's eyes. And as I say that, I think about the Matrix. I was talking to one of my homies, and I said, why did I have to watch the Matrix over 52 times? Because you know how that is when you start seeing things, you start getting a better comprehension about what's going on. You just can't exist in the world normal anymore. So, with that said, with everyone that has been on Civil Alert and, with Amani joining, and I have to say, from speaking with Amani and I have to give thanks for Anna Eid for pretty much, making the connection there with Amani. I have to say that, with speaking to him, within like 20 to 30 minutes, I had all of these bulleted points, about 25 to 35 bullet points. And so I'm like, wow, I was like, it's so much to learn, so much more to understand, books, references, and everything. So, without any further delay, I am going to bring on Anna Eid. And this segment is themed, Who is Who? You all pretty much have heard Anna Eid say that several times. And so I'll be bringing in Anna Eid, and then from there we're going to introduce Amani again. And he is calling live from Japan. He's originally from the California area. And he is also, as I mentioned on Tuesday, he was the author and the researcher of the entire chapter that was dedicated to the Compost civilization that was in the book that was edited by Runoko Rashidi, which is called The Early African Presence in Asia. Combined, Amani has over 35 years of experience, and a bonus is that he actually has field research experience. And as I ended on Tuesday, telling you all that, I can't wait for you all to hear about his excursions in Spain or Al-Andalus. So let's see here. Let me bring Anna Eid on. Islam, Anna Eid.
Islam.
Good evening. I have to say it like my girl, Bev Smith, and say, how are ya? How are ya?
I am doing fantastic and so excited about tonight's show.
Oh, yes, it's something to be excited about. So,
yes.
Anna Eid, who is who? Why does that flow through your lips so vastly?
Just to let you know, I'm sure.
Wait 1 second, Annie. I think we had a little, let's see here. There's a little disturbance on the line. Okay, continue.
Yeah. Who is who? Who is so imperative for all of us because of a lot of the reconstruction that they have done with history. And, when I started digging into Moorish history with the Sultan, I couldn't comprehend why the Sultan of Morocco, which is this continent here, and George would be having any kind of interchange whatsoever. And it kept, and I kept hearing, and people kept talking to me about, oh, well, you know, the Moors that came here got a charter from George. And I was like, but this is the Sultan's land. What does George have to do with this land? And it was so, I just couldn't get it. And then this brother sent me a picture of what George really looks like. And George is an Asiatic, melanated, curly hair brother. And when I saw that picture, everything fell into place. Everything fell into place. And then I started learning that a lot of the pictures that you see in many of these history books have been altered to appear as unmelanated people. And their features have been altered to appear as though they are, in fact, Europeans. And I was like, oh, all right. So once you start looking at that, and then you start looking at timelines, and the insignificant timelines that people need to look at is not just first, you know, prior to Reconstruction, and then go back to like prior to what they call the so-called slavery era, and then also that before 1492, which for some reason is supposed to be some historical landmark. It's like nothing existed prior to 1492. But 1492 is really, before 1492 is really what you want to look at. Then when you look at the other piece of information that's actually very important is, and it's in one of the lesson books. I don't know if it's in lesson book 1 or 2 that Taj wrote, but she talks about how they added 580 years to the calendar. So then I'm like, okay, so if they added 580 years to the calendar, is 1492 really 1492? Or is it minus 580 years? And so then if you go and look at that time frame, I mean, what was the people of that time really like, and where was this European presence that's supposed to be like really prevalent? So when you start really digging into the history of the Moors and really the Asiatic people, what you're going to find is these people are all over the globe. So now you really and truly got to dig into who is who and what is what. Because if you don't know who is who, you're going to get tricked. And if you don't know who is who, you ain't going to know what is what. So history of the Moors is like so vast, and it has so many tentacles that go off into other directions. And you know, and as Taj says all the time, we use the word Moors, but it is not the only title that we as a people have had. But the word Moors ties you to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And if you dig into the Treaty of Peace and Friendship and everything that encompasses it, what you will find is you're talking about a vast estate. And if you understand estate, then you ought to understand inheritance. If you understand inheritance, then you know inheritance cannot be bought, sold, or transferred. So once you get those components down pat, you must know who is who. Because if you don't, your what is what will be taken by foreign European colonizers.
And taken in more ways than one. You know,
Absolutely.
before we bring Amani on, I think it would be good to clarify a couple of points for people that may need the clarity in regards to how this is Morocco. Previously, when you were on the show, you did make mention of how there are several different United States. So if somebody just says that they're American, or they're, from the United States, are they speaking of the United States of Venezuela, United States of Mexico, the United States of Al-Marak or Amaruk or Amaru. Which one are they talking about? And I have to say, one thing for me that really put all of the pieces together in regards to this being Morocco is that, when you look at the ancient word within the Berber tongue for Morocco is Amaruk, Amerruk. And then when you look at how anciently, America was known by so many names, being Amaruka, which is one. And when you look at the spelling, I'm like, okay, this is a no-brainer. But then when I found that it gets deeper, when you look into the ancient, Babylonian history, and then, too, with looking at how there were naming conventions as far as naming land according to the direction that it is in relation to the rising and the setting of the sun. And it said, and this is in an old book, and you all, because, I didn't think that I would be bringing this up right now, but I can send a copy of this book to everyone if they send an email to news@civilalertradio.com. And in this book, it was talking about how it was a tradition to name any land that was settled further to the west Amaru. So thus, within what we now call Egypt, they had the Amaru Kingdom. And then in moving forward, before Morocco, it was called Amaruk. And then even moving further, coming here, which would be the furthest west, is, Amaruka. And so, we're looking at those keys like that. And, of course, with reading all the literature and speaking to you all, I'm like, okay, I get it. I see why, because this is the land that's farthest west. And then the same thing with dealing with, the other side of America, which is now known as Africa. I see that, the Maghrib al-Aqsa, which is the western portion that was farthest west, because today people think that, okay, Morocco of Africa, that's just that little portion. But there was a certain point in time where, the whole large, western, region was the Maghrib, because that's, geographically, that is the furthest west, according to, the actual landmass of Africa as we know it. So I think that's one excellent thing, to highlight. And then another thing, too, Anna, based on your research, because I remember that you had actually found some congressional records in regards to the Sultan actually stating which areas were the dominion of the Moorish Empire.
Well, it actually, and I don't have the paper, I don't have the document in front of me, but what he does is he actually names a portion of the dominion, and that particular dominion that he named did not at the time have consul assigned to it. So interestingly enough, what he did was he named that particular dominion that was coming to the table.
Can you repeat that? Because the phone had went out a little bit. You said he had named.
Oh, all right.
I didn't hear you.
Right. What he did was in the letter, it defines a portion of the dominion, and that particular dominion was certain dominions that at the time did not have consul assigned to it, so that consul can sit and talk about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship that was going to be established. And off the top of my head, it was Russia, Germany, Prussia, the States of America, Genoa, and a couple of others. And what struck me with that is Russia is a dominion of the Moorish Empire. And there was a documentation that I had read about 2 years ago, and it was talking about the Declaration of Independence, and it talked about when people to assist him in the fight, he sent to Russia and asked Russia to send over assistance. And Russia said that they would send over soldiers to assist in this fight only if they freed the slaves. So that was the deal. And the real interesting thing about the whole reading of the Declaration of Independence is if you read the Declaration of Independence, you will know without a shadow of a doubt that the slaves they're referring to is Europeans. It's right in the Declaration of Independence. So the whole Emancipation Proclamation issue was never about Asiatics. It was about freeing the slaves, and those slaves were Europeans. Once again, we go back to who is who. So, and when I read that in the letter from 1780, now I realize, because when I read that, I was like, well, what does Russia have to do with America? Now I know, right, because this is the dominion of the Moroccan Empire, and the Tsar of Russia, the Sultan of Morocco, and George, they are all cousins. Mm-hmm. They are related by blood. So that's why, you got that connection. But you don't know that unless you know who is who. And, and I just want to say this before you bring on Amani. When I first spoke to Amani, I was like, wow. It is such a breath of fresh air to run into a most honored and noble son who absolutely knows he is an honored and noble son and has done some fantastic historical research, knows who he is, and, and is just bringing it to the table, no holds barred. And I'm like, this is Fontaeus' brother. We just family member. Because he reminds me so of Fontaeus, and Fontaeus is just another honored and noble son. And and I hold these two up, boy, for other sons to know what an honored and noble son is, and just step in line so that we can have more honored and noble sons who step up to the plate and assist with, reclaiming our estate. Because it's a beautiful thing when, you can just sit back and take a breather because your son got your back. And it's just so wonderful.
Yes, indeed. I say ditto on that. For real, with an exclamation mark. Well, all right. Well, I do see that Amani is here. Islam Amani.
Islam, Santasha, Islam, Anaid.
Islam.
It's a pleasure and honor. Can you hear me clearly?
Oh,
I can hear you.
You're clear as if you're right next door.
Awesome. Okay, great. And it's a good thing to be back here. It's of course it's almost 11 a.m. Friday morning, so I believe I'm about 12 hours, 13 hours ahead in the future. So I know it's nighttime there.
Hey, you went back to the future, huh?
Well, yes. Yeah, it's amazing there. But yeah, I would just like to continue on what building on last week, and what Anna E. was just building on, just to further expand on who's who for the family, because we need to first lay the groundwork where basically the corrupted concepts will no longer be corrupted, that we can clear the fog, clear the smoke, and then we'll have a sunny skyline to where we can actually see what's really going on, and we will no longer be victims of the colored information. And so once you understand that, then you can no longer be a victim. You can recognize what's true, what's false, what's colored, what's not colored, what's connotative, what's denotative. So that's very, very important there. And so we can just start with an overview because I think there are a lot of people confused on who's who. For example, Annie E. just had mentioned that when you're talking slaves, unfortunately, now let me just qualify something before I start here. There are certain connotative words that have been applied to us and that we continue to support, but I don't do that. So when I read texts that are edited by modern researchers or writers, and those researchers are colored, and they also will use colored words, connotative words to apply to Asiatics or Moors, I don't do that. So, for example, I may read something, but the article may say, quote, black people, but then I would say replace that with Asiatic or melanin-rich or melanated, because I won't do that to our ancestors. It's dishonor. I won't cast that spell and repeat that whole process and that cycle. See, when you go up higher degrees of knowledge, you must shed language, the colored language. You must shed it, because if you don't, then you're still, a prisoner of the sorcery. So it's not shedding the sorcery or breaking the spell 50%, 68%. It's 100%. So and language is very, very important. And you know, we call ourselves educated, that we know something. Well, if you know something, why would you throw into the ethers words that you know used in the colored law game makes us stateless, puts us in a jurisdiction, puts us in a jurisdiction that doesn't have our best interests. You see, so why keep falling in that jurisdiction? See, so if you know something, you should know not to do that. Now, of course, we do have those that have agendas, and it's their mission. But that's fine, because this is war, and on a battlefield, we have to respect our opponents, and what we do on our side is we come up with our master plan, and we have to improve upon that master plan, because the landscape changes every minute, every second. So we also have to change and be flexible in order to be successful on this battlefield here. And we have been very, very successful, and we will continue to be that way. So I do not use words that keep us in the spell, that keep us in a jurisdiction that doesn't have our best interest in mind. So I will replace words like black or Negro with Asiatic, Moor, melanated, melanin-rich, etc. So I want the family to know that. So if I'm reading text, I will replace it and say that word, but in actuality, when you go back to do your own research, you'll find the connotative, colored expression in there. So,
thank you for
Go ahead.
I was saying thank you for highlighting that, because I think that's a very important point to make. Go ahead.
Yes. So let's start here on who's who here. And just, for example, where the Honorable Anna E. was talking about, the royalty of certain Moors in Europa, like King George. And let's just start there, for example. And I will share this article with the family. This article comes from a meeting between the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. When they got together in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from March 28th to the 31st, a 3-day convention in 2009, 4 years ago, to this very, very day, exactly, And what did they talk about? Well, the topic of their discussion was European skin turned pale only recently. Now, that's the topic of their discussion. So, let's just, the important thing from this article is the title itself, because the title tells us everything. So remember, they know who's who actually. They're not confused on that. But those that are currently in positions of controlling education, controlling information, they must have cover stories. They must bury certain information, because if they don't do that, they can no longer be in those positions. Those positions would be threatened. So, again, that's what they have to do. But we have to do our part as well by not falling. So the title is pale only recently. We don't really need to get into the colored article per se, but let me give you an example. I'll read a little bit of it. It says, physical anthropologists meeting from March 28th to 31st of March, and a new report on the evolution of a gene for skin color suggests that Europeans acquired pale skin quite recently. Okay. Now, the article continues to say perhaps 6,000 or 12,000 years ago. Now, we know that's a farce, and let's back that up with facts. So Annie E. just mentioned King George. That's just a couple hundred years ago. You see? So, you don't talk about going back 6,000 to 12,000 years ago, where for the most part, the planet was, for the most part, all melanated. We could just go back a couple hundred years, and a large segment of the people in Europa were still melanated. Now, since we talked about King George and his relationship to the Sultan of Morocco, and of course, King George III, you're talking, early 18th century, very still melanin rich. But let's go back a little bit before that to a very important king in Europa, Charles II. Now, Charles II is important because Charles II is actually one of the founders of the original Virginia Company, which is basically your current U.S. corporation. You see, so here we have a Moor from Europa who actually set up as partner with the other partner is actually Sir Francis Bacon, another Moor. You see, so let me also say this first, that the war has always, from the beginning of time, been more versus more. So we must first get that concept clear. The war has always been and will continue to be more versus more. That's it. And to qualify that, in the great C.M. Bay in the Clock of Destiny, Volume 1, basically mentions there's just two nations. You have the Order of Islam and the Order of Christ, right? And so when he talks about the selfish acts of the amalgamated Moors brought shame upon the Order of Islam, and had not the selfish Muslims of the Order of Islam established a superstitious religious system contrary to the universal economic and social science of the 12 signs of the zodiac, there would be no religious order of the Christ and Mary. And and then he goes into how that whole sect was started with the Patagonian blonde women, Albion women, and the Moors men, the offspring, the amalgamated children, and that's how it started. So basically, two sides, both originally Moorish. or Asiatic. One went to the dark side, and so that's what we're dealing with. So let me first complete my statement on Charles II, and for the family, go into the record book where we can give a physical description of Charles II. Just give me a minute here. If you have any questions there, please feel free to ask.
The thing that you highlighted was in regards to Sir Francis Bacon. And I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on that, because it's such a coincidence in that I was just looking at a copy of the Bacon essays that I had purchased from a yard sale some months ago for about $2, and it's like this old, the publication was like, I think, gathered around 1950s or so, but in it was saying that was originally published in like 1567. And earlier this morning, I happened to be having an in-depth discussion with a brother about clay and how it can remineralize, teeth. And as soon as I grabbed the book about an hour ago, as soon as I opened up the page, it went to an area in his essay where he was talking, where he had mentioned the word clay. So I said, wait a minute. And so for you to be bringing this up right now, that's the third, I guess, a confirmation on some things. So,
right.
With,
just to further give information to the family regarding Lord Bacon and his role in being one of the original founders of the Virginia Company. You can get this information from an awesome work that most people, of course, have. Most of your Master Masons may have this work. It's called The Lost Keys of Freemasonry by Manly. Lost Keys of Freemasonry by Manly P. Hall. And on page 243, it states here that Lord Bacon was a member of the Virginia Company, which included several illustrious names associated with the Baconian literary group. His lordship was also an organizing spirit in the whole English colonization scheme. And then, of course, it gets into, there's actually an old image of Charles II with Lord Bacon, and there's another more in that image painting as well, and it's clear what they look like, but this can be found in The Lost Keys of Freemasonry by Manly P. Hall. So let me just continue here and give a description of Charles II. Now, Charles II, we're talking 1600s, so very, very recent, and it supports the article. What did the article say? European skin turned pale only recently. These are what the American Association of Physical Anthropologists know. They talk secretly only amongst each other, but they know it as well. Now, let's put this out for the family here. Now, this comes from, this description is based upon the work of David McRitchie, Ancient and Modern Britons, Volume 2, page 8. And it says here, and there must have been many such gypsies among the cavaliers of the 17th century, not the least notable of whom was Charles II. Now let's back up before we go on. Let's examine what was just stated. It states here that there were gypsies among the cavaliers. Now we must understand what gypsy means. Gypsy is just a short word for Egyptian. Okay? So now we know that the gypsies or Moors or Asiatics were very, very educated. And Charles II, based upon this... Yes.
Amani, there's a little bit of breaking on the phone, a little disturbance. I just got a text in regards to that on their end.
Okay, am I clear now?
Yes,
Okay, so basically Charles II was a gypsy cavalier. Now, let's continue. He was of tall stature and of sable hue. Sable hue. Okay, now, let's go to the Oxford for the definition of sable, so no one's confused on this here. All right? First, I'll go to the etymon on it. Now, you have here sable, noun, mid-14th century, and it uses, quote, black as heraldic color, and then it says here, but the animal's fur is brown, and this may be a different word or unknown origin. But then let's go to the Oxford. And the Oxford here states the verb sable, to darken. Noun, an adjective, it says heraldry, black as one of the heraldic colors. Okay, so basically we know it means very, very dark. Okay, very, very melanin rich. To use a more accurate statement, that's Charles II. Okay, so when we're dealing with who's who, and when you know people from Europa started coming to the Americas, 16th, 17th, 18th century, and so forth, and we talk about settlers coming over, and the cover story that we get is that they enslaved Asiatics from the continent they called Africa and brought them over. That's the cover story we get, right? We get, for example, we're taught in schools, Abraham Lincoln freed the so-called slaves. And then part of that sorcery is that we think that Abraham Lincoln looked like Daniel Day-Lewis, who portrayed him in the recent movie, and that we were the slaves. That's the global cover story today. But no one's well-read, obviously, and no one knows the definition, and no one can really speak English, I guess, because, the royal family bloodlines, the nobility of Europa, nobility of the planet, you had to be melanated, because when you're talking noble, you're talking those that are ancient, those that are connected to the land, those that are the first. Those are the nobles connected to the land. And if you're not an original person or human, then you're not part of that, unfortunately. You are an offspring. In some cases, when we're dealing with, it's a different subject matter, but genes, genetics, altering of genes, that's a whole different subject matter. But the image, our image has been corrupted so far based upon the Jesuit education. But we're going to clear that up. Now, when we get into the word slave, I mentioned this before on the show, and we're going to bring it up here now so everyone's clear here. Because, now, there's a book written by a writer here in the 70s, and let's just quote a bit from his work here first here. And so he talks about the fraud, the academic fraud and media fraud from the controllers of education and mass communication have successfully established between the definition of the word slave and the Moor, while labeling description of historic experiences of Albions and slavery as a fallacy. So basically what he's saying is they successfully took the word slave, which applied to them, and they successfully took that word and applied it to Asiatics. And then the writer continues, yet the very word slave, which the establishment's consensus school of history pretends cannot legitimately be applied to Albions, is derived from the word slave. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word slave is another name for Albions, in particular from Eastern Europa, the slaves. And that's the Oxford English Dictionary, page 2,858 in the compact edition. And so, in other words, slave has always been a term for and a definition of a servile condition of Albions. Yet we are told by professors that it is not correct to refer to them as a slave, but as servants or indentured servants or prisoners, even though we know the very root of the word derived from the historical fact of Albion slavery. Okay, so that is the denotative meaning of the word, but we know the connotative sorcery that's been going on. So you can't apply that word to an Asiatic because it got to be their condition, their nationality, basically, that condition. Now, we go deeper into the Oxford, which gets deeper into that. It talks about the Slavonic population in parts of Central Europe having been reduced to a servile condition by conquest, and this was clearly evident in documents of the 9th century. Now, we must also understand who conquered and put them in that condition in the 9th century. Which group of people dominated the 9th century in Europa? Well, during that time, one group of Asiatics that they called the Dani, or the Danes, dominated during that time, and that's all documented. And of course, we know the Danes were melanated. You see, so these are the facts, and this is what this word is. But we've been under the spell, and we think it applies to us. If it did apply to us, and those that teaches that, ask them this question. Okay, so we are the Slavonic population from Central Europa, and we were reduced to this condition in the 9th century. But then, they're going to trip on their own line because, first of all, they said they brought us over not from Central Europe, but from the place they call Africa, correct?
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
Are the Asiatics from Central Europe? Were they brought from Central Europe?
The original Asiatics.
Well, yes.
The original Europeans, yes.
Yes, right. But were we the Slavonic population?
No, not at the time period.
No, we're not the Slavonic population. There's only one Slavonic population. And it's like there's only one Japanese population and one location on the planet. There's one Manchurian population and one location on the planet. So you got a Slavonic population in parts of Central Europe. You got a Slavonic population in another geographical location. Doesn't make sense. So this story starts to falter. The wall starts crumbling down the deeper you do your own research and start dealing with the denotative meaning of words and getting into the etymon, and the sorcery no longer work. So these are some of the things that we must clear up there. Now, I want to also continue and get further, little going back a few thousand years in Europa, and to what's currently called Scotland. And let me get into the record here. In all their secret business, the gypsies or Egyptians of Scotland used not to write with common letters among other peoples, but with ciphers and glyphs, figures of animals and beasts, such as their epitaphs and superscriptions show. Now, so it says here that ethnology tells us that one stream of modern British blood has come down from a common source with that of the Aboriginal people of Tamaray or Egypt. Tradition states that our islands were overrun at an early period by swarthy, marauding nations, of which one section alleged its descent from the daughter of a pharaoh from whom they took the name Scott, and that princess's name was Scota. Okay, now we just established for the record that we can go back a few thousand years ago, and one section, one family of Asiatics or Moors were from Tamaray. Now, when we get deeper, before they got there were Moors already there as well. So before the princess of the pharaoh Scota arrived there in that part of the world, there were Asiatics already there who were autochthonous to the land. And again, we opened up by talking about the article by the American Association of Anthropologists meeting secretly in 2009, and the title, European Skin Turned Pale Only Recently. So they back up what we're talking about here. So any questions or comments before I continue here?
Yeah. And what you just said about the ancestors being there originally in Scotland, please provide more insight in regards to the popular message that's brought forth in stating that Moors came into Europe or in Spain in 711 as if they never were there originally.
Okay. All right. Well, I believe last time I got into that a little bit, and I will just continue there a little bit to make it clear that when we're talking Al-Andalus, which is currently called Spain, Portugal, that's part of what's called the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula. Now, during the last show, when I made the connection for the record based upon America BC, that particular work, which talked about many of the nations of Europa having ties with the Moors in the Americas dating back 4,000 or 5,000+ years. And I gave an example of one time where it talked about the Iberians having relations with the Moors on the eastern part of North America, which dated back over 3,000, 5,000 years ago. Now, and let me just again give a physical description of an Iberian. Their complexion was of a dark hue, and their hair was curly. Okay, so that is a description of the Iberians. So when we're talking about Al-Andalus, and the cover story is that, General Tariq, before Tariq in 710, the cover story in 710, Tarifa went into 710 and, established a little outpost, and hence we get the word tariff from Tarifa. And there is a location there in the coast near Cadiz that's called Tarifa there. And then a year later, goes into there, and there's supposed to be some war, and the cover story is 10,000 Asiatics, and they're outnumbered. There was 70,000 Christians, and they defeated them. That's the cover story we get. And then once they went into there, they established, great architecture, universities, science, etc. Okay? So then, upon those statements, it is safe to infer or deduce that before Tarifa, before Tariq went into Al-Andalus, that there were Asiatics there.
You know, Amani, the phone is going in and out again.
Okay.
Are you on speaker?
No, I have my headphones here with my Magic Jack. Is it better now?
Oh, okay, yeah, for now. I just want to make sure we, hear everything that you're sharing.
Right.
Okay.
So we are taught that Moors went into Al-Andalus in 710, and then a year later in 711, and then that they established great city planning, government, education, arts, sciences, etc. And that when they went in there, that they were dealing with people who did not look like them. Basically, Albions, right?
Right.
Right. Now, but the problem is that's not true. Now, I just read to you that the Iberians were Asiatic. I also just read to you an article from the American Association of Anthropologists where they know that the people of Europa were melanated and that this recent genetic mutation is recent. So now I've been to Al-Andalus. So when you go there, you have the infrastructure because I would have to ask those Jesuit educators this question. How do you answer this question here? Because I need this answer, and they can't answer it. So we are also told that currently the current people in Al-Andalus or Spain wiped out all traces of the Moorish presence, that they don't recognize the Moorish presence, that they supposedly defeated the Moors and kicked them out, right?
Well, that's the cover.
When you go there, the Moorish presence all around you. The very streets you walk on were built by the Moors. Most of the buildings that are still standing there, I would say over 90% of them are buildings that the Moors built. So, for example, right across from the Granada, right across from the Alhambra, there's a little city area called the Albaicide, okay? Now, this particular city location, very, very ancient. As a matter of fact, not only the Asiatics of the Islamic persuasion, but the Hebrew Asiatics were there as well, and they were living together in this neighborhood. And it's located on top of a hill, right across from the Alhambra. And you walk through there, you'd see incredible houses, apartments that look modern, but they're very ancient. But the people today are still living in those ancient apartments and ancient homes. The underground sewage system is still intact. The train station made the train station. It used to be an old Moorish mosque. The hotel I stayed in Granada was a palace of an old Moorish nobleman. Now it's the hotel. It's a hotel now, part of the group of hotels, but actual palace. So if they moved in there, and now, mind you, that I went to this other location where I videotaped it. I took still photographs, and this was a palace of a Moorish king that dates back to over 3,000 years ago, and it still stands today. I got it on the record. I got footage of it, and that particular structure was the foundation for future architectural structures like the Alhambra. So they were there way before 7/11. And you don't, as a stranger, move into another location, create the city planning, great architecture, science and everything, and then vanish all of a sudden. It doesn't work that way, because those structures are ancient, very, very old. And I just again, we're dealing with family blood ties, you see. Now, unfortunately today, it takes a lot of work and effort for us to trace our lineage. But in those days, they didn't have that issue. Those families can go back thousands of years unbroken to the very name of each ancestor. So you have Moors who are related from Europa. They'll have family members in the Americas, in Asia. Now, give an example of that. Let's go to the record book, and one famous Asiatic family in Central Europa or Asia. Let's get into this here, and they were called the Huns. I'm sure everyone knows about the Huns, and the most famous Hun was Attila the Hun. And let's give a description of what the Huns look like. Yeah, okay, here we go here. All right. The Huns were of Asiatic origin, and in all probability of the Mongolian or Tartar stock. And the Huns are described as being of a very dark complexion, almost sable. They had shrill voices, broad shoulders, flat noses, and small black eyes. And they were destitute of body hair, almost. They never enjoyed either the manly graces of youth or the venerable aspect of age. Unquote. There's a physical description, and we're talking, Eurasia of the Huns. Okay? So, and of course, they were very, very, very awesome soldiers, of course. But, so when we're dealing with who's who, we must understand that the further you go back into history, the more melanated the people get. And that's all over the planet. But what was your point there, Tasha?
The point there, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was an old police commissioner in Philly by the name of Fred Rizzo, and he was in office there around the time when MOVE was pretty much growing and expanding. And he was one of the main ones that ordered for the police to come in and enforce the evacuation of the members of MOVE that had occupied a large house there. And he was quoted by a journalist as saying that by the time him and his crew get through with them, he's going to make Attila the Hun look like a fairy. And so it's something that you mentioned that, because here he is, he knows the history about who the Huns are. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Another thing, too, Amani, you mentioned a couple of times Jesuit educators. And then, so can you please explain, what do you mean when you say that?
Okay, well, this basically starts from the Jesuits who basically took the sovereignty of a lot of people, nations on this planet, and control the sovereignty. And they by having interest in lands, still wealth. You see, so they had to, when we're talking reconstruction of the histories, they construct all of that. So when it comes to information that goes out to the world, they edit it, they control it in all aspects of human society, be it political, be it religious, be it education. They control it because what's their goal? They must keep the Moorish information buried. But, now's the time that, it's all coming to the light now. All that was unveiled is coming to the light. And so let's go into the document, the history example of a very famous Jesuit and how he exaggerated for his own self-gains. And this particular Jesuit is very, very important. Bartolomé de las Casas. Very, very important, and we must have his work in our libraries. He traveled with not only with Cristobal Colon on all of his voyages, but with all the other famous generals, Pizarro, Cortez, De Soto. He was with them all. He lived to the age of 96, and he traveled 8 centuries. So he's seen a lot, and he knew a lot. And at one point, he actually, there's a inner battle of power and struggle between the church and the conquistadors, the military part, for power and control. So the both had to lie, and when they delivered their reports back to the Queen and King of Spain during that time, or Portugal, about what was actually happening on the ground. For example, we heard stories about they put smallpox in the blankets, and that killed off a lot of the autochthonous people in the Americas. We hear that they were cannibals. We hear all this stuff. But actually, none of it's true. It was used their own greed and power purposes to justify what they were doing. Now, and the Jesuits, similarly, the Jesuits also exaggerated things. And let's go into the record to give an example of how they lied. And then we'll go into De las Casas' work, and the English translation is Tears of the Indians. Now, and this is what he says, and we dare confidently aver that for those 40 years wherein the Spaniards exercised their abominable cruelties and detestable tyrannies in those parts, that there have innocently perished above 12 million souls of women and children. Moreover, I do verily believe that I should speak within compass, and I should say that there are above 50 millions who were consumed in the massacre. Unquote. Now, let's just examine those statements. According to De las Casas, in the bloody massacre that occurred in the places these conquistadors went, he stated there that 50 million were massacred in 4 years. Let's do the math on that. Okay? $50 million in 40 years comes to, that's basically, hold on one second, 50 million, let's do the math on this here. Divided by 40. That comes to 1.25 million people a year. Now, let's further break that down. It comes to 104,166 people a month. Now, Now let's catch him in his lie. Let's catch him in his lie, based upon the historical facts. Let's to history, and we can catch him here. Oh, hold on 1 second here. All right. Okay, now I'm going to go into the history and give an example of a scene that took place. Now, here we go here. We can cite the case in 1516 when 70 or 80 Spaniards and a caravel sailed from Santiago de Cuba to Guanaxa Islands off Honduras. They had forced the native people into forced servitude and carried them off to Havana, Cuba. The Americans were substantially able to overcome and kill the Spaniards, seizing the ship. In short, the Americans were such expert navigators that they were able to sail from Havana back to Honduras, a distance more than 200 leagues, with no assistance from no Spaniard. Now, what did we just say? We just gave an example of how 70 or 80 Spaniards tried to take Asiatics from one island to another. But what happened to those Spaniards? They were massacred because they were outnumbered. So we believe from De Las Casas that 70, 80, 100, maybe 300 Spaniards can move into a location and kill 20 million, 30 million, 50 million people. If they can do that, if that's possible, then for as long as that enemy been on this planet, we were always dominated by them. If they had that kind of power. It doesn't make sense. De Las Casas can't even count that high. He can't even count that many people, first of all. Now, let's get into some of the ulterior motives as to why he would say that. Now, also in this work, I'm gonna get back into his work here and tell you why he would have to exaggerate things for self-interest. So now here, De Las Casas had taken a few of the Spanish conquistadors to court, and he filed charges on them. And then here, he was awarded for that, and it states here that the new proposition which De Las Casas had to bring forward under his new dynasty is a very remarkable one. It formed the turning point of his life, and in its consequences had the widest influence upon the fortunes of the New World. Las Casas engaged to find 50 Spaniards which he thought he can trust and who would follow him, and the colonists would undertake the good work he had in mind and the Christian motives for furthering their own interests by lawful means. Okay, and then it states here that Las Casas eventually succeeded in obtaining a tract of land extending from the province of Padilla to Santa Marta, about 260 leagues along the coast. So he gets miles and miles of coastland for himself after, exposing some of the Spanish generals, and he's awarded. So he set up. Remember, what he put into place affected the New World, and so he was the one who set up the first the Dominican order and the Dominican and Dominica, and started setting up churches everywhere, because prior to this, the Spanish generals wanted to try to control everything. So here we have of some of the motivating factors as to why he would lie and exaggerate things. So when it comes to Jesuit education, they must, right now their mission is to keep the Moorish history buried, right? You see, so what goes out to the world must be edited by them. So we have here on the record that, and now, last week, let's go to Mexico, for example. Let's go to this chapter on Mexico. Here's the chapter on Mexico right here. Hold on a second. Okay, Mexico, which contained 4 or 5 large kingdoms, were very fertile. All this region was more populous than Toledo, Seville, in Spain. And then it states that here that the noblemen, the Spaniards, consulted, and they began committing massacres, and they forced some of the people into self-servitude and killed the remaining. Now, that's Mexico. Now, I just read before last show on the Chalk Cherokee, the Creeks, the Choctaw, and the 1540s when they were talking to Hernando de Soto, and de Soto said, well, if you help me out, I will allow you to go back to your homeland, Mexico, and I can work it out with Cortez, because Cortez had driven them from their homes. So we caught them in another lie that they were not all massacred. Many of them just left there to go to the mainland to be with other family members, but always wanted to go back home to Mexico. See, so we just clearly established for the record by factual examples of a very popular Jesuit, Bartolome de las Casas, exaggerating things. So before I go on, do you have any questions or comments?
So with that, how does all of that tie in to the Alamo? And then to like the Spanish-Mexican War? And I asked that because I recall when, and this is pretty much fast and forward, where Paul Robeson did a lot of activism work in regards to what had happened shortly after that the Spanish-Mexican War, I want to say.
Okay, well, the Spanish-Mexican War, I haven't gotten deep into that particular war. But you must understand now, let's go up a bit of a degree so everyone's clear here. When we're talking about Spaniards coming over, we must understand that those Spaniards during that time that came over were basically still talking about Moors or amalgamated, meaning, let's say, for example, you have a Moor who will have an offspring with one of his slaves. Now, that child, although can't own or be connected to the land, is still part of the family, right? And will still have, certain privileges or can do certain things. But there's remember, most Asiatic societies, the power went matrilineally. You see, now it's interesting. Now, I just read about the Huns, those Asiatics. They had the same matrilineal system. So it was all about his sister's children who become the next rulers, right? So what was I just building on there? My point. Kind of got away from my point there.
It was just in reference to, you said, bringing things fast forward. The original question was in regards to the connection between, like, the Alamo, and you were talking about the Spanish. I'm going into details about the Spanish.
Oh, right. So Right. So I want the family to be clear that when we're talking Spaniards, we're still talking Moors, because again, I opened up by stating that the war was always Moor versus Moor, and it's still that way today. And for example, when you go to Al-Andalus today or Spain, there are two national heroes in Spain. They have statues of both of them right there in Madrid, and their names are El Cid and Gustavo El Bueno, and they're titled Moor Killers. But we must understand that they were Moors, because only a Moor can defeat a Moor. Everyone must get clear on that. Only a Moor can defeat a Moor. So Bueno, for example, now he's very, very famous, and when I was there last year, I went to his castle, which still stands to this day, and of course, the former Duchess, Luisa Isabel Alvarez, who was a direct descendant of Bueno, he was politically originally on the side of Islam, but decided to become a mercenary and fight on the other side. Because remember, during that time, Christian Islam were political systems that many people changed like they changed their clothes. You see, so the king offered Bueno money and land to fight Moors. And so he took that deal and was awarded a plot of land where he built his castle, which still stands today. El Cid, same thing. You see, so it's been Moor versus Moor the whole time, and we have to get clear on that. Now, I mentioned Hernando de Soto, and I believe I sent you an image of him from the Library of Congress, and you look at the image there, clearly curly hair and Asiatic. So when you talk in Spanish American or Spanish, you're still the Spanish Automata, you're talking Moorish. You can actually use those words interchangeably, so people aren't confused on that. Because to be in those positions of high status in society, you had to be a Moor and an amalgamated Moor to be in that position, not a slave. They didn't have, they were not in those positions. So when you're talking about settlers coming over, people coming over, you're still talking Moors coming over, amalgamated Moors coming over.
I see. So that would run parallel to what we have today, where in the major metropolitan areas, the people that are over the police departments and the chiefs, they are Moors or sometimes amalgamated Moors that are overseeing a system that is locking up so many of their own people.
Well, yes, the very system this very system, again, I gave an example of the original founders of the Virginia Company, Charles II and Francis Lord Bacon, two Moors. You see, but we've been taught based upon the Jesuit educational system. They created this color crap system where there's black and there's white, and they get you caught up in that sorcery. But you're way off target when you're in that jurisdiction thinking that way. You're confused big time. You see where they tell us that Lincoln freed the slaves, but Lincoln was a Moor, and now I just read the definition of a slave, so you should know who the slaves were.
Wow.
You see, so any other further questions? Maybe you have callers that maybe want to ask a question before I continue.
Yes, for anybody that's on, you can dial option 1 to be placed in a host queue, or if you're in the chat room, you can dial 858-357-8450. Again, that's 858-357-8450. Did you have any questions?
Yes. You said something that I wanted to, make mention of. You're doing such an excellent job of reintroducing, the people, family to their history, illustrious history at that. When you talk about, and I think I kind of alluded to it, when you talk about the relationship with George and the Sultan, it's interesting. One of the few truths that I received from the public institution that they call a school is during when they were talking about how this continent was colonized, they tell you that the people that came over to work the land was indentured servants. How many people got that in school?
Oh, yes, I recall that.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Indentured servants. Now, they also tell you that they got those indentured servants from the prison. Specifically the debtor's prison.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, debtor's prison wasn't for nobles. Debtor's prison was for serfs. And the serfs were the slaves. Now, another thing that, and just to tie that up, if you watch a movie called The Last of the Mohegans, they tell you right in there, there's a European man. He says that after they finished their, I think, 6 years of indentured servitude, they were allowed to go and settle in this part of this continent that was available, and they were allowed to build a home and work the land. That building of the home and working the land didn't mean that they were given anything. And it took me a minute to comprehend that, because people were telling me that George was given a charter to the land. And to me, I kept thinking, by what authority could this land, which is the inheritance of a people that cannot be bought, sold, or transferred, be given to George, regardless of their blood connection? It didn't make sense to me until recently when I was digging and I read a couple of these charters and grants that you hear about. And what it meant was they were granted the right to work the land, not own the land. And what's interesting about that, to this day, every single European who currently has what they think owns a land, they are doing nothing more than paying rent, because inheritance cannot be bought, sold, or transferred. And if you go back and look at like Henry VIII, George, even Elizabeth, when a noble child was made an orphan, their wardship would become the discretion of the king. Now, what the king would do is he would sell that wardship to one of his nobles that he wanted to reward. And that noble had the power to do anything with that estate of that ward. A lot of times what would happen is that noble, if that ward was a female, that noble would pair that female up with his son and secure that estate into his family estate. So now, the only thing that the king could do with that estate is rent it. Now, when you look at what's going on today, you got a lot of Europeans on this continent. They would think that they own this inheritance, but they don't, because even after they are paying, how do you know? Even after you have supposedly paid off the mortgage, you still pay rent. They call it tax. So they're paying rent for that estate. They cannot, because you cannot own that which cannot be bought, sold, or transferred. So, that's just a little bit of a tie-in there. Based off of something that you said.
Yes, indeed. And everyone, we're going to take a quick break. I do see that we have several people that have raised their hands to ask a question or to make some commentary. We will be bringing you on as soon as we return. This is Sable Rising. And again, for everybody in the chat room, 858-357-8450, and that's option 1. We'll be back with you in a moment. right, and we are back, and we have live with us Amani Bey and Anaid L., and we're going to open up the lines, and we are addressing the subject matter, which is hidden history. Caller 209-277, welcome to Civil Alert. Please state your name or you're calling from, your question or comment.
Islam, and I'd like to give great esteem to all of the panel. My name is Fontes L. I want to say something. Islam. I'd like to say something in conjunction. Islam, mother. Islam, Satasha. Islam, all listeners. I'd like to say something in conjunction with Amani about this information and hidden history that once you start to examine becomes comical. It says that in 1593, De Soto brought 237 horses here. And then after that, in 1547, Mendoza brought 1,500. Now, if anybody understands horsemanship and anything of that nature, they know that a horse, I want people to really think about this. Imagine the size of a horse. If you've seen one before, in real life, imagine the size of a horse, and imagine just 237 horses being in the hull of a ship. How are you going to feed these horses? And the urine that comes from the horses. Horses drink a lot of water. I mean, horses will drink a 55-gallon drum. One horse in a matter of 2 days almost. I mean, really easy if he really was thirsty. So imagine 237 horses. Where's the water coming from? And to transport a horse, anyone who knows horses knows that you can't put a horse in a horse trailer and drive him across land without him almost being crippled. So you want me to believe that you transported 237 horses by ship, and they came off the ship and they were healthy. And amongst them, I'm pretty sure, are mares. And if anyone knows what a mare loves to destroy and kick things and cripple stuff. So you can't just, it's comical. Because they're saying that they brought all horses to the Americas. They didn't exist. Just really think about that.
Yes, and now that you're saying that, the only way that could be possible is if De Las Casas and De Soto and Cortez were originally from here, and then looking at what is being said as far as them being amalgamated Moors, that could be a possibility.
And
that's the only way they could justify that story.
They always find spurs on the coast of California. The Khalifa, they always find spurs with more symbols on them all the time, because we already were here, and Moors were excellent horsemen. And see, it just it's definitely a really comical lie. The stories that they told once you start to examine them. I mean, just imagine they claim in modern times that the largest ship was the Titanic. So they must have had some grand-sized ships. I remember asking my teacher, how did they bring, all of these horses here? And they were like, they were great Spanish galleons. They tell this story. Really think about that. The Titanic sank, and it was a great feat for them. Even the sinking, they still brag about it today, but it didn't make the trip. So imagine how large a ship would have to be to house the crew and 237 horses, and then Mendoza, he brings 1,500 horses. Now, that means someone has to take care of these horses. That's a lot of, where's the hay going to be stored? Where's the grain? And then wouldn't there not be nothing but rodents on the ship eating grain? I mean, it's comical.
It sure is.
I didn't want to take up a lot of time. I just wanted to bring that to the table and say that, Imani, you're an excellent teacher, man, definitely. Mother Anaid, you know that I love you. Sentasha, you know that I have nothing but love for you. And thank you for this forum. Peace and love.
Peace and love, brother.
And love.
Thank you.
I love you, too.
Yes, and we have Amani. Did you have any responses or comments before we take the next call?
Well, yes, that was an awesome point. The brother Fontes just brought up, because if you just analyze what they taught us, and that's an excellent point, because if you're talking 200 or 1,000 horses, now according to the other cover story, is along with those horses, they had millions of Asiatics from the place called Africa. So they said that one ship could hold 300, another ship 500. So they had 300 Asiatics in the bottom of a hole, and 200 horses or 1,000 horses. I mean, man, yeah, the ship had to have been the size of I mean, come on, it doesn't. Yeah, you got to feed the horses. The water. Where are you going to get the water from? You're not going to feed them salt water from the ocean, right? So yes, the further you examine their story, it's just weak, But it's interesting because it is comedy at its best. It's laughable, but we were so much under the sorcery that we never thought about it. We never analyzed it. We took the story and we just believed it without doing a proper analysis, confirming whether or not it was possible.
And you can see by the time the movies like Roots hit the scene, that just sealed the deal.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that sealed the deal. And what was that about? It was about Arthur Haley stealing a story from somebody, and he got sued for it later on.
Now, who did he steal that to? Because I remember steal that from. When I was speaking with Anna E., what I noticed is that the flow of it kind of mirrored the narrative of Omar Said. So who were they?
Well, we were under the impression that it was part of his family. He was tracing his family back, and that was, so he wrote the book, Roots. But it was actually a story from this female that he somehow claimed that they took her story, and she was, he had to pay her. So basically, again, it's Hollywood stuff. It's all Hollywood, and it's just magic at its best. Has nothing to do with reality or anything. You see, so very, very awesome point that the brother Fonte has just brought up. Yes, horses. I mean, that in and of itself is a science. I mean, 1,500 horses. I mean, you'd have to have that science down to pull that off. And again, now let's just go back to what I read last week, dealing with Fernando de Soto, when he were talking to the Asiatics, and they were telling him that, he was saying we were going to work out a way to get you back to your homeland, Mexico. Now, if you remember there in the story that, let me just read it again. The Indians say that after De Soto failed to find gold in the mountain countries of Georgia and Alabama, he steered his course a little northwest for Mississippi. His people divided. Some turned to the seaboard and were picked up by vessels. Some starved. Many died with disease. Now let's get into that there. So you had these Spaniards, and of course that's natural because they don't know the topography. They don't know what's safe to eat, what's not safe to eat, which plants are safe, which plants can kill. They didn't have sufficient food or water. Many of them got fed up with De Soto because he didn't find what he was originally coming to find. So, some went back, some were picked up and went elsewhere, but they were starving in a bad condition, and they died with disease. So that further damages the whole cover story that they tell us, that they brought millions, hundreds of millions of us from a different location to another place they knew nothing about. How did they clothe them? How did they feed them? How did they house them?
That's a very, very good question. Something that always stuck in my brain, too, is that when you see the depictions of some of the paintings, I'm thinking like, okay, our people are making their own clothes, fully dressed, full-length dresses with aprons and big turbans and shawls and everything. So I'm like, okay, this is looking like people who were just already in their own land, in their house.
Well, exactly. You know, so we're to believe that De Soto, Cortez, Pizarro, military men were also great architects, were also botanists, were civil engineers as well. They could just wear many different jackets, huh?
I guess.
Well, again, and I repeat this to the family, if that is true, if we buy their cover story, then the whole so-called great African ancient civilization is a bunch of hogwash. Because if those people can go to a place they knew nothing about, snap their finger, and houses will appear, they can clothe the people, they got food for the people. If they can pull that off, then as long as they've been on this planet, they always dominated us. But then they tell us about the great ancient African civilization, don't they?
They sure do.
How the hell is that possible if these people were here too? These super people.
And on that note, Amani, please share with us exactly what is Opus Dei and what is the reason for existing?
Oh, right. Okay, that's a great question there. Opus Dei, spelled O-P-U-S D-E-I, and of course, meaning work of God, God's work, was a smaller order, Jesuit order, created in 1928. Okay? Now, of course, we know what was going on in 1928. You know, the prophet was in the flesh. And again, the whole mission from the Jesuit side was to counter what the prophet was bringing forth. And one way to do that was to create another Jesuit sect that controlled information, educational information. So the Opus Dei Jesuits' duty and jobs were there. You find them in your universities when it deals with anything dealing with educational information going out to the world. So they were formed in 1928, and they had to counter what the prophet was doing. And we know what they were countering politically, but in the area of education, they had to do that as well. And so that Opus Dei order was created in 1928 for the purpose of controlling the education. And so you find them in your educational institutions all over the world. And their job and intent is to bury the Moorish information and to reconstruct their story.
So that's interesting. So with that in mind, since they're integrated throughout like the schools, universities, a lot of I should ask, do they have anything to do with the creation of these Africana Studies departments where they specifically have all this extensive course, material and have these professors there, but then when you go, there's not any, like a true expose in regards to Moorish history and our link here to the Americas?
Well, of course, right. So, they create what's called, they basically, the whole mission is to segregate or cut off ancient ties. So when you're talking about the Americas, when Christopher Columbus got over, the discovery, prior to that, the people here were, savage, just running around naked with no real infrastructure, just living off the land. That's the cover story we get. But now let's extrapolate upon that, because it's interesting you brought that up. So they tell us that the so-called Indians were just happy-go-lucky people living off the land and living off, with nature. And but now, then they tell us that, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, they brought us all over, and they built these great fortresses to house us in. We get that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let's go to the historical facts. Now, these are some of the Spaniards that came over to some of the locations like Trinidad. They call Trinidad, and other locations. It says here, natives offered to build houses for the Spaniards. The Spanish captain expressed a wish to have one large house built. The accommodating Indians set about building it. It was to be in the form of a bell and to be large enough to house hundreds of people. On any great occasion, it would hold many more. Every day, while the house was being built, the Spaniards were fed with fish, bread, fruit by their good-natured hosts. Okay, so I just wanted to give a quick example on the historical record. This is in Las Casas' work, Tears of the Indians, that, no, the Moorish architects were of course, they're here in the Americas, and we had, we're not living in teepees, the Hollywood image, and just living off the land with no knowledge of stone masonry and all that. We're the creators of it, and the so-called Indians built everything. You see, the Spaniards didn't just come over and had architectural know-how. See, so now we just have it documented, and so when they say, "Oh, we're just living off the land, going around living in little huts," it's crap.
I hear you on that. And we're going to take one more call before we close out. Let's see here. Caller 636-940. Welcome to Sable Alert. Please state your name and where you're calling from, your question or any comment. Caller 636.
Islam.
Okay. Islam, brother, how you doing?
Islam, I'm doing all right. I accidentally hit the button. I was enjoying myself, as always.
Okay. Did you have any questions or comments?
No, ma'am. I'm just enjoying myself tonight.
All right, then. Peace. Have a good night.
Peace and love.
Peace and love. Well, all right. Amani and Anna Eid, thank you so much for delivering and bringing this information forward. And I know this is just part one. Anna Eid, when I first spoke with Amani, I had so many keys, so many references. He provided so much information. And so, and I have to tell everybody that initially I was just thinking like, okay, we can do a show or two. But then when I thought about it, I'm like, okay, I think he needs to be the lead on this Hidden History series. So, I'm very, very grateful. And Amani, the last question that I have, a request, before you go, can you please do a plug for Sable Alert in Japanese?
Okay, I'll do that. But before I do that, I didn't get a chance to kind of briefly expand upon Anna Eid's point on the indentured servants. Now, because this is a research topic that we need to get into to further clear up everything. Because I'm going to read from a statement here from a work by Marcellus Rivers and Oxenbridge Foyle, an article written in 1659 titled England's Slavery. And it says, in a statement smuggled out of the New World and published in London, Albions in bondage did not call themselves quote-unquote indentured servants. In their writing, they referred to themselves as England's slaves.
England's what?
Slaves.
Oh.
And so, yes, I just wanted to bring that out there.
And which article was the source on that again? Please repeat that.
Marcellus Rivers and Oxenbridge Foyle. The work is called England's Slavery, 1659. And Marcellus, Marcessus, Rivers, and Oxenbridge, Oxenbridge, last name Foyle, Foyle.
Wow. But there you have it.
This is a research topic that we need to get into deeper. Yes.
Yes, indeed. I agree. I definitely agree on that.
So, 日本語でですね、皆さん、この本当の歴史の話を聞いていただいて、本当にありがとうございます。じゃあまた話しましょう。それじゃあ、さよなら。
All right, and that was?
Oh, wow, that is hot.
Well, just thanks for listening to this show about real history, and looking forward to sharing next time.
All right.
Thank you for providing the information.
Yes, indeed. And I have to say, Islam, salam on that. So,
Islam.
Everyone, the goal always on Civil Alert is to be informative, engaging, and third eye opening. I can tell that everyone was listening very attentively. So, I thank you all, as always. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you need or have any recommendations for something that you'd like to have featured, just be sure to send an email to news@civilalertradio.com. Again, that's news@civilalertradio.com. Peace and love, everyone.
Peace.
Yeah, have a good night.
Peace.
Oh, little birdie, spring has sprung! Out with the old, in with the new. Like trading in the big store for Dollar General. You'll get the same big store savings without the big store hassle. And with no hike to the store, you're even closer to the name brands you love. Like fresh, tastic Gain detergent. It's spring in a bottle, people! Stop by Dollar General before Sunday, spend $15 on Gain scented items, and get $5 off your next trip. Dollar General, it's the fast way to save.